Okay, let's just jump right in. I want you to close your eyes for a second and imagine waking up before the sun even rises. You're in a cramped, dark little room provided by the city, and you are completely, utterly alone. The air inside your room is already heavy. It's thick with the scent of smoke and dried mint, but you know it's nowhere near enough to mask the reality of what's waiting for you just outside your door. You are a 17th century municipal plague doctor, and today, just like yesterday, and just like tomorrow, you have to step out into a dying world. In this explainer, we're going on a seriously deep psychological dive into the crushing isolation, the visceral sensory horror, and the incredibly tragic irony of one of history's absolute most misunderstood figures.
Now, to even begin to understand what was going through the mind of this doctor, you really have to understand the world they were walking into. We are talking about absolute, unparalleled societal collapse. The plague was ravaging Europe, wiping out tens of millions of people, and under that sheer weight of terror, basic human bonds just completely dissolved. Look at this chilling quote from the 17th century writer Michel de Saint-Martin. He says, "Fathers abandoned their children, spouses refused to assist one another." That is wild to think about. The streets outside the doctor's window weren't just highly infected, they were totally devoid of humanity. Healthy people were hiding, priests absolutely refused to give last rites, shopkeepers boarded up their doors and windows. This ghost town of terror and abandonment, this was the doctor's daily commute.
And I really want you to try to imagine the sheer sensory reality of this job, specifically the smell. You see, this was way before germ theory. Back then, people fully believed that disease was spread by something called miasma, which was basically corrupted, poisoned, bad air. The physical stench of decaying bodies and infected fluids literally filled the city streets. And as the doctor, your only defense is to fight that overpowering, horrific odor of rotting flesh with a sweet, sickeningly intense mixture of camphor, mint, and cloves. It was a suffocating olfactory nightmare. The absolute worst smell of death and the intensely sweet smell of your own medicine became permanently and viscerally intertwined in your brain. So, moving into Section 1, Armor Against Miasma, Deflecting Bad Air. Let's look at exactly how these isolated doctors attempted to protect themselves from this invisible, foul-smelling enemy.
Okay, we all know this incredibly iconic look, right? It's the ultimate symbol of death and fear. But here's the thing a lot of people get wrong. While we usually associate this exact outfit with the medieval Black Death, this specific head-to-toe uniform actually wasn't invented until 1619. It was created by Charles Delorme, who was the chief physician to King Louis XIII of France. Because everyone believed that those sticky, smelly miasma vapors could literally catch in the fibers of your normal clothes and give you the disease, Delorme designed what was basically impenetrable armor. We're talking boots, breeches, a long coat, and gloves, all made of waxed Moroccan goat leather. And if that wasn't enough, it was all thickly coated in hard white animal fat just to make absolutely sure the bad air was repelled from head to toe.
But obviously, the most famous element of the whole getup is the beak. And this wasn't just to look scary. That massive 6-inch beak was literally a portable good smell chamber. It was absolutely stuffed with something called theriac. Now, theriac was this legendary and frankly bizarre medical compound made up of over 55 different ingredients. I'm talking viper flesh mixed with honey, myrrh, dried roses, carnations, and really powerful spices like cinnamon and cloves. Often they'd even shove vinegar-soaked sponges in there too. The logic was basically to fight fire with fire, or in their minds, fight the evil, deadly plague smell with incredibly strong, supposedly purifying, pleasant smells. They genuinely thought this crazy mixture would filter the poisoned air right before it hit their lungs. Now take a close look at those glass spectacles built right into the mask. Those were there to completely seal the eyes off from the miasma. But just pause and think about the psychological toll of wearing this thing all day. You are physically trapped inside a heavy, sweltering hot, fat-coated leather suit. Your entire field of vision is tunneled through thick, foggy crystal glass, and you are desperately trying to suck in enough air to survive through just two tiny little nostril holes poked into the end of a leather beak that is packed with damp, pungent herbs. I mean, talk about a dark, claustrophobic, and suffocating reality. All right, let's get into Section 2, Walking the Dead Streets, a Grim Harbinger. So fully encased in this suffocating armor, our doctor leaves their isolated quarters and steps out into the visceral horror of the city. This famous 1656 engraving from Rome perfectly captures how the terrified public actually saw them. The plague doctor existed in this incredibly dark, liminal space. Think about it. They were technically hired by the city to bring hope, but instead, they instantly became these grim harbingers of impending death.
Imagine being a sick, terrified citizen, praying for a miracle, and suddenly this towering, human-sized bird demon appears on your doorstep. It literally meant your house was marked. It meant death had arrived. As time went on, the public stopped viewing these doctors as healers altogether and started seeing them as literal monsters. Parents would even warn their kids to behave, or the plague doctor would come and get them. The psychological burden of being universally feared and hated just for trying to do your miserable job must have been completely soul-crushing.
And because they were walking through these terrifying, unpredictable streets, the doctor always carried a long wooden cane. Now, this wasn't just some fancy walking stick. This was a critical tool for survival and early social distancing. They used the cane to take a patient's pulse from afar, to lift heavily infected clothing without actually touching it, and, this is the truly tragic part, to physically beat away desperate, aggressive victims. People would literally rush the doctor, begging for salvation, or even demanding that the doctor whip them with the cane in repentance, because they fully believed the plague was a direct punishment from God.
Which brings us to Section 3, horrific cures and bloody miracles. Because what actually happened when the doctor reached a patient? Well, brace yourselves, because pre-modern medicine was a wildly gruesome affair, all based on these ancient Greek and Roman theories about balancing the body's four humors.
Take the live chicken treatment, for example. Yes, you heard that right. This was an absolutely bizarre, real historical procedure that was derived from the ancient physician Avicenna. So the doctor would take a live chicken, pluck the feathers entirely off its backside, and then place that bare skin directly onto the patient's swollen, black, excruciatingly painful lymph node, which they called the bubo. Then the doctor would literally hold the chicken's beak shut. They actually believed that by forcing the bird to try and breathe from its backside, it would magically pull the poisons right out of the patient's body. They would just hold it there, wait for the chicken to die from the so-called poison, toss it aside, and then repeat the whole thing with a brand new chicken. I mean, it really just highlights the absolute barbaric desperation of the era.
And the chicken thing? That was just the beginning. The remedies these guys used were desperate, they were agonizingly painful, and frankly, they usually made the patient much, much worse. Doctors practiced extremely aggressive bloodletting. They would take unsterilized blades to slice right open those giant egg-sized buboes to drain the pus and black blood, and then they'd cauterize that festering open wound with a literally red-hot iron. It gets worse. In some of the most horrifying cases on record, victims were actually coated in mercury and then placed inside ovens to bake the disease out. Or their swollen glands were deliberately covered in human excrement. It's so hard to wrap our modern minds around, but these were not cures. They were agonizing tortures that almost certainly sped up the patient's death and spread even more infection around. Let's pivot a bit to Section 4, the bureaucrat of death, state bookkeepers. Because learning about all those horrific treatments brings us to a really shocking realization about who was actually inside those bird masks. You see, these practitioners were very rarely highly trained physicians. The real, experienced doctors, they had mostly fled the dying cities, along with all the wealthy citizens. The plague doctors who were left behind were usually second-rate medical practitioners, young, naive volunteers with zero experience, or sometimes just random, ordinary citizens. We're talking fruit sellers putting on the mask. They were hired by the city magistrates not to heal people, but to be state bookkeepers. Their true, legally binding, contractual duties were just to compile daily death tolls, witness the final wills and testaments of the dying, dictate quarantines by literally sealing infected families inside their own houses to die, and sort the sick to be shipped off to terrible island quarantine colonies known as lazarettos. They were essentially just heavily armored bureaucrats of death. So you really have to ask yourself, why on earth would anybody volunteer for this? For some of them, it was absolutely the money. Desperate cities offered incredibly lucrative municipal contracts to literally anyone willing to do the job. But man, it came with massive risks. They were in such high demand that some plague doctors were actually kidnapped by rival towns and held for ransom. And beyond the danger of the disease and the kidnappings, their contracts mandated a completely miserable psychological existence. They were legally obligated to live in total, crushing quarantine themselves. They were entirely separated from the healthy population to prevent them from spreading the disease. It was a life of total isolation, surrounded 24/7 by nothing but death, screaming, and hostility. All right, let's move into Section 5, the tragic irony of survival, accidental protection. And honestly, this is where the whole story comes together. Because despite literally everything they got wrong about science and medicine, that nightmare-inducing bird costume is actually considered one of the very earliest examples of personal protective equipment in Western medicine.